You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host, recording from Washington, D.C., Ankit Panda.
And I'm your co-host, Katie Putz, recording from Maryland.
Hey, Katie, it's hard to believe we're already at the end of 2022. The year has flown by, but I hope it's been a good one for you.
Well, it's been a weird one.
Yeah, but it's good to have one last opportunity to come together on this podcast to reflect on some of the bigger themes that I think defined the year gone by. And I know our listeners will get a preview of the upcoming issue of the Diplomats magazine, which tells them what to expect in the year coming ahead. So we won't talk too much about that because I tend to avoid predicting the future because you tend to get things wrong. But looking back on the year, I mean, I think we. So the way Katie and I sort of came to this is we each sort of came up with a list of things that we thought really jumped out, themes, events, broad trend lines that defined the year. And I think, Katie, it's going to be probably unsurprising to most of our listeners that both of us basically ended up with the consequences of the Ukraine conflict and its fallout in Asia at the top of our list. I think it's really unsurprising. It's a major war in Europe implicating Russia, which continues to be a relevant actor in Asia with a variety of different diplomatic relationships across the region. Ukraine's impact on global supply chains for food and so on and so forth have had rippling effects. The energy consequences, I think, really when we look back at the year, there's no getting away from the fact that this war has had tremendous consequences for Asia and of course the whole world. But beginning with that, I think what's interesting is, of course, last year, I think when we did a similar episode, everybody kind of expected there was a lot of uncertainty about what exactly was going to happen. The Russian military buildup was known, and now we're more than 300 days into this conflict. When you look at what we've kind of seen in Ukraine, and we've had this discussion several times on this podcast throughout the year about how various Asian states have responded. What really stands out to you in terms of the most consequential consequences of this conflict on Asia?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think first of all, just how consequential it was for Asia, and that can be seen in a myriad number of ways, from sort of India's conundrum being, a partner of the United States in the Quad, but also, getting the bulk of its military equipment from Russia and being put in a weird diplomatic in-between space. Certainly, nowhere has the war in Ukraine been more sort of close to home and consequential than for Central Asia. And I've talked about that a lot on this podcast. But I think the economic repercussions, there was a lot of talk about food security this year, particularly because Ukraine provides a lot of grain exports to Asia. To the energy angle, again, India imports energy from Russia, so does China. But there's sort of this pressure in Europe to try to use energy as leverage against Russia, but it kind of puts everybody in a difficult position.
Mm-hmm.
I think one thing I did want to highlight was with regard to Central Asia is at the beginning of the war, we all sort of expected there to be negative repercussions for Central Asian migrant workers in Russia and the remittances that come back to the region. The World Bank warned about a decrease in remittances. The analyses that came out at the end of the year, however, sort of said the opposite. Central Asian remittances from Russia were at all-time highs this year. And that was in part a recovery from the pandemic slump, but also was reflective of demand in the Russian labor market. If you can think about individuals having to go fight in Ukraine, that leaves space in the market for workers. And honestly, the limitation of Ukrainian migrant workers used to be a large number of Ukrainian migrant workers in Russia. Those jobs could be taken by Central Asians as the war started. Of course, this is a upside that may not last and probably will not last for a number of reasons. But I thought it was kind of an interesting repercussion that I was not expecting, and sort of the year proved me wrong. We do our best.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think I certainly think we'll be back to talk about how the Central Asian states are broadly thinking about their long-term geopolitical relationship with Moscow after this conflict. I think that's going to be one of the bigger picture issues over the next year or two, honestly. I mean, nobody knows when this war will end exactly, of course, but post-war Russia, what will that look like? What will the implications be for Asia and the European security architecture? And I think Central Asian states being right there on the doorstep will have a lot to say about that.
Yeah, and then there's just one other thing on in that vein. A lot of countries in Asia have sort of tried to walk a balanced position, none more so than Central Asia. But I think the ledge that they're walking on is getting increasingly narrow. It's getting increasingly hard to sort of both sides this conflict. And I think as you noted, I think as we go into the next year, we're going to see where the real sort of triggers are for falling one side of the balance or the other. But it's definitely a dicey situation.
Mm-hmm. The other thing, just the last thing to say on Ukraine and the implications for Asia is I think, I mean, this war has shown, I think, many Asian states, particularly some of the more prosperous democracies in this region and their publics, that war is something that can happen to contemporary developed countries. I mean, the fact that the largest country in Europe is finding itself at being invaded by its territorial neighbor, I think that has reverberated in Asia, where you've seen sort of public opinion shifts in places like Japan, South Korea, and even elsewhere in the region about just attitudes towards defense budgets. We'll talk about this in a second, but of course Japan's new national security strategy. Many of the forces leading up to that national security strategy had been in motion before the war started, of course. But I think earlier this year, Prime Minister Kishida, when he delivered the keynote at the Shangri-La Dialogue, he was very explicit. Ukraine today could be East Asia tomorrow. So just this idea that modern interstate conflicts over territory are not a relic of the 20th century. They are something that could very much still happen in our world today. And I think for a lot of Asian states, that's been an important takeaway from the Ukraine conflict.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think before. So I was in Taiwan for a week in November. I don't think absent the war in Ukraine, there would have been so much discussion in Taiwan about Europe, but there absolutely was, and I think that's reflective of that particular possible conflict, but also just the impact more generally of the war in Ukraine on Asia and Asian geopolitics. Really, sort of thinking through the fact that, as you noted, this kind of conflict can happen. There's no reason it can't happen. It just hopefully doesn't.
Right. So the next one we had both on our list again, Katie, is China's move away from zero COVID and sort of the reactions to the domestic unrest that we covered just a couple episodes ago on this very podcast. So given that we've talked about the protest part pretty recently, I think it just is worth focusing on the incredibly consequential shift in Chinese public health policy that will have global consequences. Again, I mean, just in terms of the availability of PPE and sort of materials to protect patients from COVID, that's going to be highly sensitive to China now seeing the surge that it is, with estimates suggesting that more than 200 million people have contracted COVID since China moved on its internal policies. It looks like in the new year, China will also open itself finally to something like more normal travel flows from outside. But this one I think is really a major development this year. Perhaps not a surprising one, given how, as we discussed on the recent podcast, how difficult it was becoming for Beijing to sustain the types of lockdowns that it had been implementing in the lead up, especially to the 20th Party Congress. So where do you stand now on sort of the broader significance of zero COVID? What else should we be thinking about when we look back on the turn that China has made this year?
Well, I think it's we ran an article recently that pointed this out. Some of the rolling back of the COVID zero restrictions began in early November, but it was very slight. And then it really accelerated after the protests. And now it's as if zero COVID had never existed. It's not mentioned by Chinese authorities anymore. And they've gone the absolute opposite way, and sort of in January plan to essentially throw open the doors and welcome foreign travelers to come to China and without having to do sort of an extended hotel quarantine. I don't know how many tourists will want to travel to China, but we're going to see a lot of Chinese travel, I think, outside of China, and that has repercussions because as our listeners will know, most countries in Asia and certainly in Europe and in the United States have really pulled back on a lot of the COVID restrictions. When you're traveling Asia, people will still wear masks on public transportation and in public in some countries. But further than that, in Europe, for example, I rarely saw anybody wearing a mask in public. So I'm thinking about Chinese tourists coming to Europe or really the rest of Asia, and the possible repercussions in terms of transmission of that, if you don't have these restrictions in place in the countries people are traveling to, but we're going to get sort of a new circulation of COVID coming out of China. Now, I think obviously the Chinese people are the ones who are going to suffer the most from this sort of dramatic pullback of COVID zero in China. It certainly seems that there was not a well orchestrated plan to get out of this, and they just ripped the Band-Aid off. And I think, as with many things, it's difficult to judge the exact scale. We've seen reports that China's official numbers are not counting COVID deaths if somebody had a pre-existing condition, which really sort of muddies the water in terms of the numbers. But things like lines at hospitals, not having enough ambulances, funeral industries sort of churning up at a clip. These are sort of the things that we can observe from afar, that are going to tell us about the scale. But I think it bodes sort of poorly, especially coming in the winter in the Northern Hemisphere. And then as we lead up into sort of Chinese New Year, end of January and into February, that's when you would traditionally see a lot of travel within China and within sort of East Asia. I certainly would have concerns about new circulation in that time period, just because there's just this pent-up demand for travel.
Yeah, and I mean, in general, when you have the virus, circulating in a large under-vaccinated population, you also do get the possibility for new variants emerging, which I think is something that local disease surveillance centers in places like Taiwan, Japan, Korea are keeping an eye out for right now. Japan, I think, has started restricting certain forms of travel from China, and I suspect that'll be a trend that we'll see in the region as China sort of catches up to the rest of the world in terms of where things are with the pandemic more generally. So I think this is going to be, one of the big takeaways from this year, and I think it will have significant effects going into the new year as well. So the next one, I guess, Katie, is the inter-Korean dynamics that have, again, always no shortage of news from the Korean Peninsula. We just had news of a really remarkable sort of drone incursion by North Korea into South Korean airspace. But more broadly, I think, this one really jumped out to me overall from what we were sort of observing this year. We came back to talk about this on the podcast several times, but yeah, that one was definitely on my list.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly just if you look at the numbers of missile tests in North Korea in this year versus previous years, there's clearly something going on. Do you think, I've been meaning to ask you this, do you think that maybe a factor in that was that everybody's been paying attention to Ukraine? So North Korea's like, we got time, we got space, we have things to test. Do you think that had any kind of influence, or is that just sort of cutesy modeling?
It's hard to say. I mean, my sense is that, so I guess my somewhat hot take is that regardless of the result of the South Korean presidential election and regardless of Russia's war in Ukraine, I think the North Koreans would basically have done what they did this year, which is test a lot of missiles. I think where the difference is at the margin, especially on the domestic political situation changing in South Korea, is the way in which North Korea has responded, right? The Yoon administration came into office and immediately started talking about deterrence capabilities and decapitation of Kim Jong-un and preemption, and the North Koreans, of course, responded poorly to that, as we might expect them to. And then the final 4 months of the year, we've seen this sort of remarkable spiral between the two Koreas, where the North Koreans, in early November, they launched more missiles in a 24-hour period than they previously had in their record their record busiest year of missile testing, which was 2019 when they launched 27 missiles. And so that I think is really notable. But the other thing is, is this all leading up to a potential crisis and a clash? I was just in Seoul a couple weeks ago, and, the concern in Seoul is that, maybe all of this spiral is leading up to a 2010 style crisis when the North Koreans shelled a South Korean island, killing civilians, and they sank a South Korean Navy corvette, killing more than 40 sailors. Right now, it actually seems like both Koreas are really emphasizing proportionality. The North Koreans, earlier this summer, Kim Jong-un said that his mantra for dealing with the U.S. and South Korea was going to be power for power, goodwill for goodwill. So if you do something that we don't like, we're going to respond in a way that you won't like. And then the response on the South Korean side has also been proportionality. So just to give a couple examples, the North Koreans send drones over the military demarcation line. The South Koreans will send drones back over to do their own reconnaissance. The North Koreans shared a satellite image of Seoul. The South Koreans shared a satellite image of Pyongyang. The North Koreans launched eight missiles. The South Koreans and the U.S. will launch 7 missiles and 1 missile, 8 missiles in total. So there's this focus on proportionality that, in my opinion, isn't really doing much to deter the North Koreans, because the North Koreans are going to be willing to accept a tremendous amount of risk, which I think is another concern this year, is that they are just becoming much more risk acceptant. This drone incursion, for instance, I think is a very good example of that. It's actually this is exactly the kind of thing that could have been perceived by the South Koreans as the beginning of an armed attack, right? You have 5 drones coming across the military demarcation line into sensitive airspace near the national capital, near international airports, and the South Koreans followed standard operating procedures. But that, I think, is concerning sort of going into the new year. So yeah, the inter-Korean spiral, I think, is a big one. There's still no signs of de-escalation going into 2023. And in 2023, we're looking at the 70th anniversary of the U.S.-ROK alliance. The North Koreans have demonstrated a lot of capabilities that I think they're going to continue building on. So there's a lot of ways for this crisis to continue, I think, festering and spiraling.
Always cheerful news from the Korean Peninsula.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we'll be back to talk about this, but the next one on our list is actually one that I'm excited to talk about because we haven't done a podcast on this in a long time, and I think that speaks to this topic broadly, just falling out of first page headlines around the world after the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan last year. That is, of course, the status of Afghanistan, the state of the Taliban regime there, and some other developments. But Katie, I'm going to turn it over to you to kind of walk us through the big developments there this year.
Yeah, so the reason I wanted to include this on this list is I was looking back through all the things that had happened in 2022, and I had almost forgotten that Ayman al-Zawahiri, the leader of al-Qaeda, was killed in a drone strike in Kabul this summer. At the time, it was really big news, and it sort of catapulted Afghanistan back into international headlines very briefly. And more bigger picture, it really underscored the fact that the Taliban is neither capable nor interested in controlling quote unquote terrorist groups in Afghanistan. Zawahiri was living in Kabul. I'm sure the Taliban knew that he was living in Kabul. The United States found out he was living in Kabul and sent a drone to take care of him. And so I think that, really exposes what the United States and Western powers that had spent, 20 years in Afghanistan were concerned about in terms of leaving Afghanistan, is that the country could return to being the kind of place that groups like al-Qaeda can hide out and muster forces and then plan attacks in the broader world. Obviously, in Afghanistan right now, the big group to watch is the Islamic State's offshoot. The Taliban has said that they have taken care of this group, but throughout the year, there were a number of attacks either attributed or claimed by ISKP, Islamic State Khorasan province, that, are extremely worrying. Now, a number of those attacks targeted Shias and Hazaras, schools, and sort of honestly institutions and people that the Taliban doesn't do a great job of protecting in the first place. But they've also targeted media organizations and government buildings. And so I think within that mix, the Taliban is de facto in control in Afghanistan, but I think it's a tenuous kind of thing. And this might seem somewhat unrelated, but, the Taliban had promised and pledged that it would allow girls to re-enter school in the spring. That never happened. And then just in the last couple of weeks, the Taliban has banned girls and women from universities and elementary schools and working at NGOs, sort of eliminating pretty much every piece of social and public presence for women. In my sort of view of this is I think it really shows, in conjunction with the Taliban's inability or unwillingness to get a handle on groups like ISKP or al-Qaeda, that there's really an ideological battle at the heart of the Taliban. And it's either we stay ideologically pure, so we can't sort of fulfill these things the international community wants in terms of women going to school, or we risk losing members to groups that could destroy us.
Right.
And so I think the Taliban has obviously picked group cohesion over international recognition. That's a thing that in this year, when I was writing my outlook for 2022, that was a thing that I said to watch for was, whether and if the Taliban would be able to get international recognition. I think at this point it's pretty clear that they're not trying to. But it makes it a very concerning year. But as you said, Afghanistan really fell out of headlines. Obviously, we've continued to pay attention to it here at the Diplomat, but it's just one bad story after another.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, we have, I guess, fully now entered the era of so-called great power competition, which I guess is a good segue into the last big topic that we have on our list. And this again is a sort of a year-ender buzzer beater kind of item that we would have normally, I think, dedicated a whole podcast to, but we can briefly talk about it now and probably come back to it in the new year, which is Japan's new national security strategy, which wasn't a surprise. The Kishida cabinet had indicated that they were working to conclude the new national security strategy by the end of the calendar year. I also think it wasn't entirely surprising what the national security strategy ended up saying, which is that Japan perceives a dramatically different threat environment in Northeast Asia compared to when the last national security strategy was written in 2013. And as a result, Japan is getting serious about national defense. And so I think it's no exaggeration to say that this is the most significant post-Second World War rethink of Japan's military capabilities. The big headline item that's received a lot of attention, of course, is Japan's pursuit of so-called counter-strike capabilities, which basically mean missiles that are constitutionally being justified under the idea that Japan would use these missiles once an armed attack has already been initiated, so they're compatible with the self-defense constraints that exist in the Japanese constitution. And so the new national security strategy and national defense strategy emphasize that the government hasn't really changed its position on the constitutionality of these capabilities because there's sort of precedents going back to the 1950s about these kinds of capabilities being permissible for Japan. But I think it really speaks to a long-standing interest, particularly within Japan's Liberal Democratic Party, the ruling party right now, in basically normalizing Japan's capability to act as a normal defensive player on the world stage. I think Ukraine has had an effect on this. North Korea, just the overall decline in the regional threat environment. So this has been a realization of a long-running interest within the Liberal Democratic Party to normalize Japan's defense capabilities in this way. So, I think broadly you could even compare this a little bit to Germany's, Zeitenwende, although I think the Japanese are much more likely to follow up on the goals of their new national security strategy than Germany might be, perhaps. But it is, I think, a reflection of Japan acknowledging a changed world in many ways. And so this, I think, is going to be a major feature of the security landscape. I think it's going to affect the U.S.-Japan alliance as the alliance continues to adapt to new contingencies and scenarios in Northeast Asia and East Asia more generally. So that, I think, is the last thing we had on our agenda for today, Katie. But before we close out, of course, it's the end of the month, which means we're going to have a new issue of the magazine out. And why don't you give our listeners a bit of a preview on what to expect?
Absolutely. So in the upcoming January 2023 issue of the Diplomat magazine, we have our traditional start of the year cover story, which features an all-star cast of Diplomat regulars providing us with some real guidance as we start the year. We asked 11 authors to tell us what to expect, what to watch for. I wrote the Central Asia section and the Afghanistan section. Ankit wrote the U.S. section. We cover all of the regions and countries that the Diplomat pays so much attention to. I'm not going to spoil it, but you've gotten some previews in this podcast. There's a lot to watch for, and honestly, a lot to worry about in 2023. So it's the best prep that you can do. The issue also includes 3 long reads, one of which takes us to Kazakhstan, which I did not talk about in this podcast, but this feature in the magazine examines the state of the social contract a year after the dramatic and unprecedented, the violent protests in January 2022. We also have a piece focused on Nepal and its perpetual political instability, just as the country's new government gets its footing. And finally, we take a look at the repercussions of the new U.S. semiconductor export controls for Washington and its allies in Asia. There's a lot more in the issue, and I really urge you to check it out and get started in 2023 a little bit ahead of the curve.
Yeah, I mean, I think that all sounds like essential reading, and I haven't read the other 10 authors' contributions to the What to Expect section, so I look forward to going through that soon once the magazine's published. But with that said, Katie, I think we've come to now the end of our last podcast for 2022. So the last thing to do, I think, is to wish all of our listeners, of course, a very happy new year for 2023. Thanks for sticking with the podcast and listening through this year, especially to those of you who also reached out with suggestions for topics. We, of course, do take that into consideration. But with that said, thanks a lot for listening, as always. And if you like what you heard, make sure you subscribe. And if you've been a subscriber but you haven't yet left us a review, please do that. It really helps us get the word out about the show, and we really do appreciate that. So thanks a lot. And thanks a lot to you, Katie, for joining me for another year of great podcasting.
Thank you, Ankit. Happy New Year, and I'll see you in 2023.